Well, governance in Africa is facing many challenges. Nations are struggling to stay united. Democracy is facing the constant threat of leadership. Now, economies are struggling at the behest of poor governance. Poverty is increasing. Job losses are on the rise. Yet more than ever, these are the times when governance and leadership are of utmost importance. From the west to the east in Southern Africa, the problems are different. The consequences are the same. On VSA today, we continue our focus on governance in Africa. Welcome, I'm Sulaiman. Well, the issue of governance in Africa has become a teething problem. Citizens are increasingly growing unhappy with the leaders, and the window of patience is getting gradually shut. The political parties, largely supported by the people, are losing followers as their policies, practices, and purpose become increasingly questionable. In some countries, it's political high-handedness. In others, it's corruption. Some countries are struggling to deal with security challenges. Just last year, more than 200 people were killed as some South Africans protested the jailing of former President Jacob Zuma. Losses of goods as much as $1 billion were recorded. The situation again brought to the fore the role of the governed in the matters of governance. The African National Congress, the ANC, which has been at the center of South Africa's politics since 1994, lost a heavy proportion of its support during the local council elections in 2021. The people are discordant with the country's progress and policies. Raila Odinga, for the fifth time, announced his ambition to become the president of Kenya. His announcement has courted mixed reactions. Kenyans in general are not sure of where they are headed as their governance and candidates raise more questions than hope. War, elections, violence, protests, constitutional robbery, and many more problems are facing Africa. What's the solution? Where are we headed? Excited to have Professor Macharia Munene as a Senior Associate, Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies, Nairobi, Kenya, and Nonkululeko Moyo, political analyst at TNGO and UCT Political Science alumni South Africa, professor, and I think Moyo. I was going to ask which I should go with. Professor and Moyo, thank you for your time, and apologies for stumbling and stuttering on that, Moyo. Very quickly here, let's start looking at the metrics for assessing what we call a good government on the continent. I'll start with you, Professor Munene.
Well, the challenge of good governance is work in progress. There are some countries that can be given credit for making the effort, but there are also others that have behaved in manners that are not very encouraging. So they do things that are contrary to the interests not only of their countries, but also of their people. And so when their people are suffering and not feeling good, then there is an aspect of bad governance that needs to be looked into. And because the purpose of governance is to look after the interest of the people in that particular state and to look at them in a positive way, not negative. So there are some places where there are questions to be raised and others that maybe some credit should be given for making the effort. I think among the countries that can be given a bit of credit for trying to make the effort is, of course, the new Tanzania, being led by Suluhu. She has a nice name. Suluhu is a solution. It's a good effort. It's a good effort for that sake. But there are then those other places where we still have questions to deal with. and hope that those are things of the past, that the future, the year that we have started, there will be some improvement in the way some governments behave towards their people and their countries.
Well, Professor Munene, I think it's a fine way to start off the show by also letting us in that, well, there are places where we'll give, thumbs up and some places where we give some knocks. Now, let me bring in Moyo here and quickly. Moyo, we've seen how the continent is going and how its youthful population is driving policies and actions across the continent. Let us in on what you think about Africa's youthful population and the promise it holds in changing their different countries and ultimately the continent.
Thank you for that. So I want to jump in quickly on the previous question and what the metrics would use, because it's going to be very relevant for this. Now, if we're thinking, and this is a very controversial line, that liberation struggle, liberation movements, and liberation leaders, when countries transitioned into their new democratic dispensation or post their colonial leadership, is a good qualifier for who gets to lead and where in Africa. The issue with thinking about today's crises is there are more and more young people who are not as tied to the ideals, the hopes, and even the imagination that existed at the time that these countries were stepping into liberal territory. So now what you are thinking about is young people who have serious needs, job crises, and are more connected to a global world that has set new standards and new demands for citizens and their relationship with the government. So when you are thinking about young people, you almost have to instantly imagine that there is a new front, a new wave of a political need which will create crisis, and then there has to be different political provisions put in place to be able to cope. So if we're thinking about coups and military coups, the same way we thought about them in the 60s and the 80s, unfortunately, we will not be able to resolve the current crises that you're seeing happen in different points, whether it's Libya or Mali or Ethiopia. You're going to constantly face lacking contributions to the situation. So young people are definitely bringing in new questions, and the questions of provision, mobility, accessibility, financial security are on top of the list.
Well, Moyo, I'll come back to you. Professor Munene will help us here with ideologies. He's been working on so many things about the continent, and the last time we spoke, we tried to talk about ideologies of different African leaders, past and present. Gauging what we have seen across the continent, from east to south and even west of the continent, Professor Munene, do you think there's a shift in ideologies, by what, kind of movement we're looking at, just trying to understand the political terrain?
I don't think there's much shift in terms of ideology. And there also appears not to be very much clarity as to what ideologies we are talking about. And it is also doubtful whether the leadership, people in leadership, have any ideology apart from being in office and surviving and ensuring that nobody else comes close to the center of power. The ideology in terms of the way ordinary people think about is not very clear. Not the way it was some times ago in the 60s and the 70s. You could see clearly people who are trying to espouse a particular ideological position. Currently, it's kind of difficult to say this is an ideological angle. This is what this one stands for. Of course, there is attempt. The president of Kenya tries very hard to promote Pan-Africanism, a revival of Pan-Africanism as an acceptable continental ideology. Unfortunately, there are not very many takers to that kind of thinking. We do have a challenge across the continent of the survival instinct. And like last year, we saw we had a problem in some countries just that were seen to be doing well for some reason, and they start plummeting downwards instead of going upwards. The classic example of this is Ethiopia. You had a prime minister who started very well with a Nobel award, and then everything went haywire last year. And so you look at it, say, why did it happen that way to a country that appeared to be so promising? And you look at other places. Of course, you don't want to talk too much about Sudan, which is in a total mess right now. Keep on shifting prime ministers, and the military and the civilians can't agree on how to run the show. Not to mention the interest of the big powers, the extracontinental forces, that would like to have an input in what is happening. Even when you look at Southern Africa, it has some of these rufflings of feathers that are worrying to the extent that we wonder what is going on. And on top of all these things, we do have a global problem of the coronavirus that has been devastating many countries in a way that was not expected. And there is also, of course, some power play in this thing. We saw a very strange development in Southern Africa. In Southern Africa, the scientists identified the Omicron variant of coronavirus. And then the country that already had Omicron itself started putting sanctions on the African countries for just saying that we have identified the disease. That was, it showed something, a dissonance in the international arena, and the manifestation of continuing racism in the way you operate things. I think a little later they corrected it a little bit, and because it was so blatant that they had to be called out, and they kind of withdrew. But these are some of the concerns that come up. And can you say that there is an ideological angle to any of these things? Very hard to say so. There may be one or two people trying to sound ideological, but they're not making a very good job of it.
Well, I think somehow, Professor Munene, you've been able to establish something which is very key here, talking about the audacity, the audacious, move by African leaders and some world leaders who were, greatly concerned about that outright ban or blanket against the continent on the discovery of the Omicron variant. Now, quickly, let me bring in Moyo. Moyo, let's talk about grassroots democracy. And we saw that in South Africa, where about 30% that was a big one. Just 30% of eligible voters turned out to vote. So let us in what this means, to the belief of the people in their leaders. 30%, that's an appalling rate if you put that on the scale.
Well, interestingly, we would have recorded a decline in certain individuals showing up to the polls, and also with more younger people actually being eligible to vote. There was also shorter numbers than what was anticipated. So we're thinking about people who actually registered to vote, did not show up, or those who did not even take on the responsibility to elect the president. Above that, what we are almost inclined to think about when we think about South African democracy is whether or not the African National Congress, the sitting party, which has a liberating movement, so a liberation movement history, should or should not be assessed as the qualifier of whether or not South Africa is doing well. If you speak to the average person, what you soon realize is when you talk of South Africa, you have to constantly negotiate the fact that it is a settler colony, meaning that when the colonial era ended, we had a situation where there was a white minority that remained. Now, when you think about resources, development, and all of the functional parts of the economy, again, because we are settler colony with previous histories of the country being run in a certain predicament, you have the white population minority running most sectors of society, and the black majority almost being subservient. So they are the minor workers, the hard laborers on all of those parts of society. So what we're looking at the polls currently is just a reaction reaction of South Africans to their apathy towards the leading party, which has really done a lot of harm in continuing to grow a minority within the Black majority of people who are directly gaining from state resources. These are people who are able to bid for tenders, to get government deals, to service parastatals, to sit on boards and financially benefit as a Black minority. So when the Jacob Zuma situation almost turns out, it is a direct contradiction. I'm not sure if we're going to cover that, but when you had poor people who had not been given enough to cope during COVID go out in looting in defense of a leader who represents the corrupt minority of Black bourgeoisies in the country, you almost don't even understand what the intentions of the people are. But if you follow that the ANC has always been a liberation movement fractured into two, with a bourgeoisie, the rich who were able to be educated, and the underclass that was willing to fight to leave the country, and Jacob Zuma informs that camp, then you understand why people will find themselves resonating with this contradicting figure who both represents the current corrupt age of ANC leaders, but also a historical face of those who were always going to fight for their place at the table once the ANC had taken over power. So we almost have to look at how the majoritarian party system works to favor how a democracy then represents the performance of the leading political party, whereas the people's views and their emotions are almost tied to other developing, whether or not they're able to get service provision. We've had, since 2007, a rampage of protests across the country. So are people happy with the ANC? Not at all. Are people happy with having a democracy? Who is to say? But certainly people know what they need and they know how to cry out when they do not get those services met. And we have to see how the economy performs, how people are able to recover financially to determine whether or not the democracy or the ANC in power under the democratic dispensation is going to survive the current outrage that we have seen, especially in relation to former President Jacob Zuma's arrest and the subsequent social unrest that happened. So very interesting times, but we should really focus on who we imagine is currently a representative of what a democracy being a success is or not. And it's the same thing that we think about Ethiopia. When you think of Ethiopia's success as tied to the presidential ability to have gotten the Nobel Peace Prize, we're shocked when the same person exhibits behaviors that are then undemocratic. So we imagine, how are we then going to assess whether or not Ethiopia is a thriving, a successful, or even stable democracy? So we should always imagine ourselves asking, who is the actor, the political actor in question, and how does that influence our own projected analyses of whether or not that current situation is a stable democratic process. And then obviously coups and military, which we're going to get into, are a very defined sort of territory. Once there is social unrest, where there's military, militia, armies, we have a serious threat to democracy, which is not...
Let me jump in here, Moyo, for a bit. Apologies for butting in. And this is to you, Professor Munene. Listening to Moyo, one of the key things, because she also went, she had to stretch it and asked a very pertinent question there, asking who is our representative. Now, we're going into grassroots development here, grassroots governance. And typically, if you go to Kenya, that is another area where they have a very strong force. The county's election, as against what we saw in Nigeria. How can Africans not make the same mistake Nigerians have made, to the extent that council elections or grassroots elections are not, boisterous or fantastic anymore, as we have seen in South Africa and Kenya?
Well, elections are opportunities for people to say what they would prefer and who they would like to govern. The unfortunate part is that the people elected or candidates are not always very honorable. So they do not adhere to the principles of elections. So the fact that people will create reasons for rejecting the will of the people. And that is assuming that the will of the people is reflected in the ballot. Those people who then try to negate that, then make it very difficult for the populace to feel represented. And it puts a big question mark on democracy as such. Of course, many of the countries are not democratic. They are more republican than democratic by nature, because representative governments are the Republican ones. Democracies are not very many, although they call themselves democracies. So the possibility of instilling in potential leaders to be honest to their constitutions, to their promises, would be one way of moving in the right direction. At present, the feeling generally is that politicians are not to be trusted.
Well, anyway, I think we should also bring in this quickly here, and I want you to start off with this before I come. I lost you for a bit there, and I thought you were done. Apologies.
Okay. Yeah. No. I think I was talking about democracy as being fluid, and people not having the same understanding of what that democracy is supposed to be. And if they do not have the same understanding, whether they are the leaders to be elected or the voters who are putting them there, the motives behind each of them is one of the challenges that we face as a continent. And then very unfortunately, in many of our countries, we have not had good leaders who believe in the constitutions that they swear in to uphold, and they keep on maneuvering to figure out how to subvert the very agreement. And for that reason, the impression that the leadership may be trying to subvert the essence of republicanism then creates dissonance and room for grumblings and potential upheavals. And so you have the makings of uprisings, because uprisings come up when the perception of unfairness on the part of the leadership becomes magnified. Then people think that they have no choice but to do something alternative to the norm. And when people are pushed to the point of doing the alternative, then we have a problem in a lot of places. So democracy is fluid, partly because of the leaders we have not behaved very honorably in many places. Not all, but in many places.
And has Professor Munene, has Africa been able to harness the roles of traditional institutions in governance?
There is a lot of talk about harnessing traditional, the term used most of the time is traditional methods of dealing with crises or conflicts, rather than some of the techniques that were brought in under colonialism, because one of the main things that colonialism did was to reorganize everything and throw away the African institutions and create new organs that were supposed to be followed. And some of those new organs have not worked very well. So there's been a lot of talk of going back to better ways of dealing with the challenges that do arise. And I think it was in Mozambique, they tried to figure out how do they deal with the conflict that they had come up with. And I think some of them thought that the best way is do the best you can to forget it, or not deal with, not talk about it too much. And in Rwanda, you had said, let's talk about it. And the Gachacha court system. And there are always these appeals. Even in Kenya, you have some people say, how do we deal with the elections? Let's reach some consensus of the elders, particularly some parts of the country. So elders who agree on a particular person, and then that one becomes accepted as a democratic way. So there is that appeal across the board that other than the methods and the information and the instructions given in the universities that most of us have gone in, attended, we look for something different and maybe it will work. And this is, if I may say, one of the tragedies in the African continent is that it has had excessive advice from the former colonial masters on how to run their own affairs. And when they get that advice, it is not necessarily in the interest of the country concerned, because it's supposed to serve the interest of the advice giver. And we have a number of instances when that has been the case, that really people with bad intentions are sent to Africa to give advice, and then they go and say some strange things. So that in itself is something that the African countries need to deal with, how to deal with or examine the sort of advice they get from these donors or the aid peddlers. So if the aid peddlers are going to be saying, do this, you need to ask yourself, what's in it for them? And they should not tell us.
Certainly not that. We'll come back and we'll stretch that. Let me bring in Moyo before we go on a break. And Moyo, I know you have your own idea to some of the key questions I've just asked Professor Munene. And it also exists in South Africa, the traditional institution. And as Africans, we hold these institutions, but somehow their role haven't actually been so spelled out in some of the statutes of some of the African countries. Let us in on your thoughts on that.
Did you call them again? Because I think I want to do a bit of some of the work that I do in language, linguistics, and political imaginations. We said they're traditional what? I want you to use the reference again. What was it? The traditional councils, right? So a good example for that. So I think we're using an outdated reference, an idea which no longer services what we're trying to study or observe, and that's why we don't come out with answers that can help. A good idea to think about that is the situation in Swaziland. So Swaziland, as we know, experienced early on this year and before that, a youth uprising which was against Tinkundla. So Tinkundla is what we would consider the cultural or traditional constitution of the political process. Now we imagine that people are no longer wanting traditional forms of leadership, and that is incorrect. What we are thinking about is identity politics. So if we were to change our framing of the conversation and said that we understand from a behavioral perspective that voters and citizens are always looking to elect, on the one hand, representation that is aligned with their identities. And then democracy has a responsibility, on the other hand, to ensure that there are institutions supporting whatever imagination the people had voted for through their constitutional leadership. Then we start to think of identity differently. We start to think of what people are doing differently. For instance, Nigeria and Libya or other territories which are in Africa, religious fundamentals will also be part of the conversation, because if people will not vote for Jonathan because Jonathan's religious appeals serviced a certain part of Nigeria, but would vote for Buhari, when Buhari no longer services the people who aim to benefit from putting them in power, that is when you have internal conflicts such as militia and coups, because people are not going to wait for the next election. So people aren't voting out or aren't moving against traditional institutions of negotiating power in Africa. In fact, people are saying, and mostly young people are saying, that they no longer identify with the ways in which they are managed, imagined, and also the ways in which they are catered for in that society. So it becomes a winners-losers game, because the people, if we imagine the citizens as thinking beings, are trying to secure their best benefits. So whatever historical conditions has caused certain divisions in that country, it will have more power than you imagine that it is some kind of rejection of traditional models and more modern models of democracy. No, people are voting for their interests. It's an identity question and not a traditional into modern forms of democracy question. And even in Swaziland, when you think, well, that is quite a traditional society, so it must be a modern question. No, young people are saying the Tinkula system no longer fits how you imagine that the monarchy is servicing our identities, because we want more. If we see the current prime minister's daughters and the king's children living a lavish lives, and we're not getting jobs and we're not catered for in the economy, we want to be able to negotiate power on our own terms and elect our own leadership into the central governing bodies. And that question might seem like the same thing, but it is quite nuanced if you call it identity crisis, as in the crisis of people trying to elect or align themselves with the leadership that's going to secure their benefits, versus thinking about people moving away from an old traditional model to a new model, because people will always see themselves in reflection to the ways in which their identities are manifested and constantly transformed by the society that they exist in. So nobody is stuck in a traditional past or trying to move from the past. People are just trying to secure their benefits, and they will negotiate in and out.
Sorry again to butt in there. We'll talk more about the benefits and also talk about the coups, which because Professor Munene talked about uprising, and we'll weigh in looking at some countries that have experienced some coups on the continent. That's when we return. Well, if you just joined us, you're watching VSA here on News Central Television, and we're looking at governance on the African continent. And specifically, before we went on the break, we're talking about grassroots governance, which is increasingly getting poorer in Africa, and the perception of governments is also as well taking a hit. Ghana has continuously stood out as a country with an exemplary democracy, but it hasn't come without challenges. Some Ghanaians are less than impressed with the practices and policies of the government of the day, with protests held in 2021. In countries like Chad, there's the expectation of an election after the country's age-long leader, Idris Deby, was killed by the adversaries he battered all through his tenure. Senegalese are also growing increasingly discontent with President Macky Sall. It is believed that Senegal is facing its most dangerous threats to democracy yet under Sall. I have with me Professor Munene and Moyo with looking at some of the key things. It's our home run here. Let me quickly start by talking about some of those other things we haven't touched on, Professor Munene, with coups seen in Guinea and Mali and Chad in recent times. Do you think that these coups are capable of, taking these countries and any other country thinking of such further down the ladder?
By their very nature, coups tend to underdevelop the place. There are very few that can be said move the other way to the better. but generally they tend to bring the countries further down from where they were, and not to improve. That is not to say that there are no coups that appeared to have made sense, in the sense that the lives of the people improved, or the governments of the day had gone to the extent of destroying the country, and therefore the country needed some saving from some unusual quarters, because the voting will not do it. But in general, the coups tend to bring down the countries because there is no progress that can be made when there is chaos. They create instability. If the coup plotters don't have their act together, they end up plunging the country into a civil war, or various mini civil wars, which then have the effect of becoming transnationalized to the neighboring countries. And so you have all those wondering now, if it is happening there, is it going to happen here? It creates more concern in the region and not just the country concerned. So the various coups and coup attempts were not necessarily for the benefit of the countries concerned or the people in those regions. They tended to draw the countries backwards instead of moving forward.
Let me bring in Moyo here. Moyo, you know, we've seen democracies that are more or less dictatorships in Africa. Now, does this reduce the belief of the people in a democracy?
I mean, certainly we again have to go back to, we are not far from the liberation psyche, which is that people were freed through arms from oppressive governments. So when the new government, which is aligned with, the Darling references, and that's why President Mugabe, his soul rest in peace, was revered for so many years, even though he was rightfully charged for not being able to provide a fair and democratic dispensation for Zimbabwe post whatever election that he had decided he was going to stay in power until death. So people certainly did not vote for Mugabe or Abiy or whoever it is that they put in power so that those people retain the power, and necessarily over time they put them in power so that they are able to secure their benefits. So people will not believe in democracy in so much as it allows, for instance, for presidents in certain countries to be able to change the constitution, to extend their presidential stays when they are able to rig elections and use existing government institutions to hoard power, a power that does not benefit the people. So certainly, so long as people are not receiving their end of the bargain, they will not believe that a democracy is anything but a change of name for what is oppressive government systems.
And Professor Munene, we've seen military rulers, as I said, in some rare cases, we've seen some amount of good. Is it safe also to say, for instance, we've seen military rulers switch to democracy on the continent? Typical example like Yoweri Museveni and the late Idris Deby. Is this a system that holds any good for the continent?
Well, I guess the question that comes up, and one that has been raised in different places, is whether democracy is good in itself everywhere and to whom. And then the understanding of what that democracy is. We have had peculiar things, being told that a coup in some places is democratic because it serves the interests of the external powers. And so we are told that's democratic. So the understanding of this concept of democracy is an issue in itself. And when there is no consensus on what it is, then we have problems. So because it was portrayed as simply getting the votes, how the votes are obtained is not the issue. People vote and the votes are counted and then it is announced. The announcement becomes the real issue. not the voting or the counting in some other places. And we did see about 2 years ago, a bad example from the US about the whole thing, that democracy argument. When Donald Trump lost the election and refused to agree that he lost, and actually created almost a civil war in the country. So then they came up and said, what's going on here? And now, if that was to happen to an African country, maybe the hula baloo would have been even bigger. That it was, what do you expect out of the Africans?
In that case, let me jump in here, Professor, quickly, so that we don't lose the thought of the Donald Trump US example. In that case, would it be safe to say the people, that's the American people, saved their democracy? So if that is, I want you to now link that to what we've seen in some parts of the continent. Specifically, we can also talk about what's going on in Sudan.
See, then, the United States as a global power, which trumpets itself as the exemplary democracy, does not believe in democracy as such. Its constitution made it very clear that it did not believe in democracy. The framers of that document made it very clear. Now, when that example is seen that way, then it becomes a big issue. How can you lecture somebody else when the evidence is that you really are having problems understanding what it is that you are saying to yourself and to other people? Now, the issue of Sudan, a lot of problems inside there from the time of al-Bashir. But Sudan was not simply an issue of the Sudanese alone. It appeared to be more an international problem in Sudan and how to deal with it. The fact that you had a president who was indicted, and then you had some effort to sanitize him later. And then once that didn't work, then some engineering, and you bring in somebody from the international institutions to be the prime minister, and now the prime minister has resigned. He had been uncomfortable with the general. The linkages between the general and the World Bank IMF operating just could not mesh. And was it doing well for the Sudanese people? The place seems to be in a bigger problem. Instead of improving, it's getting worse in that place. And there are demonstrations on the streets almost every day, which is very disturbing and underdeveloping of the country itself. And it might then spread to Egypt, might spread to Chad, which is already in problems. And there is concern it might go down to Southern Sudan and Uganda. Already Ethiopia is another case in itself. So the challenge of Sudan has bigger ramifications than appears to be the case. But it is not simply a problem of the Sudanese people. It is their problem, yes, but they are not alone in this. And so we have this, if they hold an election, which they probably should, it is not clear how it would go. And if it goes the way some people don't like, then it will be discredited and destabilized. There was an official in the West who said that the next time you press a country to have elections, you make sure that your side wins. How you make sure that your side wins in a foreign country is part of that challenge that Africans have to face and deal with, because sometimes elections in Africa African countries, and not just elections in that country, because the interest of the bigger powers is so apparent, so pronounced, that one wonders whether it is an election for that particular country, or is an election for the United Kingdom, United States, France, or whatever it is. And we have had instances when one of the big powers was the ones actually even guaranteeing the announcement of the supposed result. So it's a dicey situation that we find ourselves as Africans.
Let me bring Moyo here. You've already established that, and Moyo, Professor Munene has said it's a dicey situation. But again, if you look at it, violence and conflicts no doubt threaten the development of many countries on the continent. Regional politics is very key here, and it is one of the precursors of these conflicts. How do you bring the conflicting structures together? Looking at what has happened in Sudan, now the Prime Minister has left the government, leaving an all-military government in place.
Now, certainly, I think when we evaluate whether or not how are we going to even accommodate the fact that coups, military takeovers are quite a frequent form of political transition in Africa. I think one of critical ways in which I've thought about this for as long as I've studied politics is a quote that said that if you gave a man a gun and not ideology, you had a potential criminal. So if we're very honest about whether or not we can accommodate a radical, because for some territories, let's think about it, it is quite important to acknowledge that if Mugabe has been winning elections for almost how many decades, there must be a justified overturn within the country to try and secure different governance, a governance that's going to secure the interests of the people, as I've made that point earlier on. But revolutionary change is not a means that can evaluate an end. It is an end in and of itself. Once political power has been wrestled through violent means, we have to ask different questions. So the only legitimate violent takeover or removal of a dictator would be one that would be followed by free and fair elections, and elections that are able to account for all of the ways in which the previous government was justified to have been removed. Now, we do not see these successions because we have criminals who are trying to secure rulership over state resources to ensure their own benefit. And we should not be two ways about that. But secondly, we have regional bodies that are not acting in the favor of Africans, not making decisions or directing resources in ways that they should. 2020, surprisingly, was the deadline for silencing the guns for the AU. Do you want to guess what the report looked like? I could give you a good idea. I was one of the people that were compiling a semi-report for the GMAC, for the Secretariat, and I could not put a single page together on what had been done to support the movement to take away arms from young Sudanese, young Ghanaians, and all of the, because there are countries like Nigeria and Niger that have a lot of illicit arms, which then facilitate the ability for it to be easy for these violent takeovers of military to be the way of political negotiation of power, which is something that we should not embrace. But in the instance where it is necessary, then all of those coups would be followed by legitimate structures of power and successions that are able to make the lives of the people better. Is that what's happening? Is that what's going to happen in Sudan? Certainly, I do not believe so. So our assessment must continuously question the motives of the political process, but also whether or not these processes should come with more than what we assess them to offer us. It's not about a new government. It's about whether or not you are able to provide for the imagination and the needs of the people who are seeking for that change, should it even be justified by the masses and not simple militia that has elevated. And a funny example is the M23. You know, the situation with Kabila and the General Gabriel, it was a shocking thing to see a statesman actually be in charge of arming people who were then going to defeat the stable governance in certain parts of the country. That tells you a lot about how much trust and what the source for the push for the change is, and whether or not that change is then going to see a successful democracy, which is always going to be one that centers the people, their needs, the growth of the economy, and other imaginations that would have been discussed on or agreed upon in the policy phases of choosing leaders.
Well, Professor Munene, let's close on this, and let's see if we can go back in time, specifically 2010. I still recall that meeting at the African Union in Uganda when late Muammar Gaddafi spoke to journalists. He said specifically that his dream of a United States of Africa was still alive, and he was looking forward to that. Do you think the AU, or bringing African leaders together, to have some kind of objective conversation, will further help reduce coups and bring the much needed development on the continent?
I think the dream is still there and it's good. And maybe that's why Gaddafi died, for having such dreams. The issue is for the various African countries to re-examine themselves, each of them to re-examine themselves, and remove some of the obstacles, communication, travel, trade obstacles. There are too many of them, that we continue to trade better with European countries than with fellow African countries. That's an obstacle in itself. The visa regimes and such things like that. So the dream of activating Pan-Africanism into something beyond the political rhetoric is something that can be worked on by committed people all over. But to do that properly, I think there is need for re-examination of the educational systems in the African countries. It so happens that we have deliberately ignored those subjects that reinforce the identities of a people, their cultural, their historical background, and their knowledge of national interests. We have too many people in positions of responsibility who are ignorant of national interest and of continental interest. And if we can clear that, then it will be possible to really do something about the African Union and remove the cobwebs that hinder progress towards that. So the answer, yes, it is possible, but it will take some serious effort from all sides to actualize it and to realize that the opponents who don't want that to happen are more than the ones who are saying that. That's why it is, but it can be done. With some commitment.
I think that's a fine place for us to leave it. It can be done. It's good to be optimistic. At this point, I'd like to thank you both, Professor Macharia and Munene, and Nonkululeko Moyo. We hope to see better governance on our beautiful continent soon. Thanks for staying with us. I'm Sulaiman. Bye.